in any setting, you can't help but notice the inequities. And what are the actual things that you can put in place to combat inequity? And so that's really what, why we did this. And so I felt really strong coming into it. Now, how I felt as I was going through the startup phase, that has gone up and down. The emotions of having a startup and a startup with your husband are plenty, but the feeling of taking the leap was strong, was strong. I felt very strong. I felt very solid in that. And I still feel solid in the overall vision. There are way more grassroots nonprofits than there are big, shiny, federated ones at the top. Not that they don't deserve funding too, but the idea that small nonprofits that are scrappier, less polished, don't deserve information, don't deserve funding. Yeah, that's the mission. That's the work. Yeah. Because when you try to leave them behind, you're leaving all the people they serve behind.
Welcome to Black Philanthropy, Our Stories, where each episode spotlights awesome Black and African American leaders committed to transforming lives and communities through philanthropy. These authentic conversations will inspire, challenge, and remind you are not alone. Here's your host, award-winning writer, director, and founder of Samuel and Murray, Michelle Renee Jackson.
Hello there. My name is Michelle Renee Jackson. I want to thank you today for taking your time to trust us with your time today on Black Philanthropy, Our Stories. I'm so pleased to introduce you to our guest today, Francesca Axam Frederick, who is the CEO and co-founder of Grantyd. Frankie, we're so grateful for you today. Thank you for taking the time to be with us. We are looking forward to hearing more about the work that you and your husband Dwight do on Grantyd.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Michelle. So yeah, I am a fundraiser by trade, and how I got into fundraising was through the arts. So I guess I was a dancer first. And so the work I do is centered around philanthropy, specifically grassroots, small nonprofits. And what my husband and I do, we've created a multitude of tools and also services that specifically are used as equity builders for small nonprofits, grassroots organizations, and any nonprofit that just needs more of a holistic look at the philanthropic space and the work that they're doing in their own organization. Yeah.
When did you first learn that one could even work in philanthropy?
Yeah, it was actually, I think it was Jacob's Pillow Dance Festival. I had gotten my start kind of in the arts nonprofit space working in events, ticketing events, house managing events at the Boston Conservatory where I went to school to study dance. And from there, I knew dance, being a performer wasn't right for me. And so I took an internship at Jacob's Pillow Dance Festival. I ran the theater there, the Ted Shawn Theater there. One of, honestly, the greatest joys of my life was working at the Pillow as an intern. But there was another team there, and it was the fundraising team. And it was the first time I really got to see fundraising up close. I think I'd always known about it, but it was the first time I got to see it happening. And, I moved to New York, and from there, I just set off to, have this career in philanthropy, specifically supporting Black artists. Actually was really where I got my biggest start, grant writing for them, supporting them in their endeavors. And yeah, I've been fundraising ever since.
Good. So let's back up for a moment. So what kind of dance were you doing when you were a performer?
Yeah, so my degree is actually in contemporary dance. I think that's what it says. But yeah,
Okay.
but I've always been really drawn to ballet. I grew up doing, my mother's a dancer, my aunt's a dancer. So I grew up doing mostly Horton, which is what the Ailey company is is rooted in. That's their technique. I grew up doing a lot of Dunham technique, which Catherine Dunham was a prolific creator and dancer and choreographer who brought together um, African dance, Afro Caribbean dance, ballet, modern, just a multitude of things, and created her own technique, Dunham. And my aunt was certified in the Dunham technique. So I grew up doing a lot of Horton, a lot of Dunham, so modern dance, and then a lot of ballet.
How did you know that performing wasn't what you wanted to do?
Oh, I never liked it. I can't remember a performance. I can remember one performance maybe 2 performances that I've loved, and it was because they were group pieces, and I was doing the work with my friends. It was a very, communal piece. I was dancing with my friends, the people I loved so dearly, but I can remember 2 times that I felt comfortable on stage. And so then I realized that it was actually the community of dance that I love so much. And dance still moves me to watch. I still feel very empowered by seeing dance. I even feel empowered by taking class, but I never felt empowered being on stage. I never felt empowered in a solo. Um, I always felt kind of burdened by those moments. And so, yeah, I realized that it was the community aspect of the dance. And when I realized I wouldn't be able to have that ongoingly, like it wasn't going to always be that, I realized that maybe performance wasn't for me. Yeah. Probably about my sophomore or junior year of college.
Okay. Well, early but
Yeah,
late,
right.
right? Like, so early in the college game, but then also well, not late at all. It's always on time, right? We're always on time when we finally figure it
Yeah.
out. Never too
Late
late
when
to
it
figure
came
it
to
out.
paying, conservatory tuition prices.
That's right. That's right, that's right, that's right. And so then you saw fundraising at Jacob's Pillow, and then tell us more about what that was like. What was it that attracted you to fundraising? Because as you're well aware, I think we're all well aware, fundraising can be really scary to people. So that was exciting to you is interesting to me. What was it interesting to you about fundraising?
It was actually the donors. So Jacob's Pillow is a dance festival in the Berkshires, and it's this little beautiful cove where people who are dancers, dance supporters, dance enthusiasts come together. And this idea that all these people came together to support this one thing, I was so moved by it. And, you know, the understanding that dance is one of those things where it's not of all the art forms, I would argue it's one of the hardest sells. Um, you know, it it's specifically concert dance. And so to have this place where researchers, dancers, artists, choreographers, literally everyone, people who can't dance, who've never taken a dance class, coming to surround themselves around this art form. And a big part of how that mission gets moved is dollars. And so I was really interested in just how we move these little worlds forward. These corners of the universe. I was really interested in the mobilization of what some may consider extremely niche, but to others is their everything. I was really interested in the mobilization of that fiscally, and so yeah, I think, and even just from a uh, what is it? Just a thought perspective or a psychology perspective. Why people feel so moved to be part of these communities and give to these communities and push their efforts, their dollars, their time, even if we're talking about philanthropy as well as volunteering, in kind donations. Like I was always very interested in how people felt so moved so much that they devoted themselves to, or even parts of themselves to this place, this work. And so that's what got me really interested in philanthropy. Yeah.
What year was this that you got your first job in
Yeah,
fundraising?
so, my first full job in fundraising, so right out of Jacob's Pillow, I went to work for Manhattan School of Music, and there I was working in the event space. So that was about 2014. I was working in the event space, but at the time at Manhattan School of Music, all events were free, and so it was donation based. So we now had this kind of, donor aspect to the events because they were, just like what you felt you can give. And so we used events as a cultivation tool to get people to give and be part of the landscape. So that was my first like real step into fundraising with events. And then I started grant writing. I started grant writing. I started interning, and I was with organizations like Pinnacle Dance Works, where I got my first fundraising internship, and worked with a wonderful creator, Dave Alois Farron Dance, who is a New York based artist. Worked with another organization called Purpose Productions, who supported Black arts organizations mostly in Brooklyn, and so got really my fundraising skills working with small grassroots individual artists, Black dance artists, um, grant writing, supporting them, supporting individual giving, and yeah, So around 2014, 2015 is when I really started to get into fundraising.
From 2014, 15 till now, is there a particular gift that was particularly meaningful for you to be able to close, to raise, that maybe didn't work or it did work?
Yeah, I think my time at Covenant House, Georgia, which is a federated nonprofit, they have multiple locations throughout the United States and internationally. They serve youth experiencing homelessness. Um, I transitioned actually from the arts to human services, and what an eye-opening experience. It has utterly changed my life to have done that work at Covenant House, Georgia, and to be in community with people within the human services space. I can't speak highly enough about that organization. And I think at that time, one of the some of the gifts, I mean, all of the donors have been so impactful, but I think creating specifically conversations around some of the events that Covenant House did. Covenant House throughout the Federation does an event called Sleep Out, where you sleep outside in solidarity with youth homelessness. And I was able, at the time, my husband was working for Google. And, we had had this tech boom in the pandemic where you see all these tech companies giving to philanthropy. And I saw that Google had a team the year prior and didn't raise anything. And so I went to my boss, the chief development officer, and I was like, "What's up with Google? They just expanded in Atlanta. Like, why aren't they a bigger player?" And she was like, "We haven't been able to get them involved. And even some of our youth had gone through some of their certificate programs." And I was like, "Absolutely not. Like, not on my watch." And my husband was working there at the time, and so really, you know, kind of needled my way in. I said, "Hey," to my husband, I was like, "You have to get a team together. Get one of your higher ups, get people across, however many." And it was still a small team, but they met the goal, the $5,000 goal. They met that goal, which was awesome. And then from there, Google ended up having another team come and do a volunteer project with a program we have for young mothers who experience homelessness and have children. And then from there, Google became a title sponsor at the Covenant House Gala. And so, all that to say is like it really is, sometimes it's less about one big gift and the impact that building a relationship and the steadiness of that relationship and your impact overall can have on an organization, and introducing an organization to another organization, and just those building blocks. And I actually had left Covenant House, Georgia, and I remember seeing the gala program, and I messaged my boss. I was like, "Wait, Google's a title sponsor?" She's like, "Yeah," and it just showed the work we had done as a team to build to get those building blocks to constantly eat. I tell people all the time, it's with fundraising and philanthropy, it's never a no for me. It's just a not right now, and maybe it's just a not in this way. Um, But it's never a no. I do genuinely believe there's always a way to be in community, always a way.
So this never a no for you. I think for a lot of fundraisers, it the no can be so devastating. It can feel so personal. What When did you realize for yourself that a no was a not? Not now, not yet.
Yeah, it was actually at when I was working at Atlanta Ballet. It was actually a program that I was responsible for stewarding the ongoingness of this program, but I wasn't the creator of it. But it was a program with Home Depot and Atlanta Ballet. Home Depot, as many people know, they support veterans. That is their main, as a corporate entity, that is the main work that they do. But also, they're headquartered here in Atlanta, so they do care about where I am. I'm in Atlanta, and they care about Atlanta deeply. And so, Atlanta Ballet, obviously, every organization wants to be in community with large corporate headquartered entities, and they created a program where Home Depot actually um, funds the cost of discounted tickets to veterans to go to ballet performances. And when you first think of Home Depot and Atlanta Ballet, the only connection you would see would be, oh, they're both in Atlanta. But that's not enough, right? And so to be able to find a model where obviously in the dance world, people are looking to get diverse audience, get more butts in seats, to have people and their families come to performances, to have a model that both services veterans who is, Home Depot's, that's where they put their money. And then also to be able to, not only give to Atlanta Ballet on the ticket front, but as well as just the visualization front for people who could see their work. I mean, what a beautiful partnership. And it's not on something at the surface level that you would imagine right away. But then to see it play out, it makes so much sense. And so philanthropy and fundraising is creativity at the end of the day. It's creative ways to come together, whether that's with an individual donor, a major donor, a family foundation. And I even say to that, people always are looking on how to be in more relationship with corporate entities. And I always say, like, corporate organizations are humans. They're just people. It's all major gift work. It's all people work. And so that's why for me it's never a no, because there's always a way to be in relationship. It might not look how you thought it would look, but there's always a way to be in relationship with people.
When you are fundraising, how do you not focus so much on the ask, on the dollar amount? Because I think for a lot of nonprofits, they are relationship sounds great, but they're bleeding money or they're in so desperate need of money that relationships tends to be long term, right? So how can I keep this relationship 1 year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now? But if someone is thinking about their operating budget this month and what they need next month, then the idea that they'd be thinking about, okay, how can I manage this, next year, for a lot of EDs is just impossible. And so I wonder for you and your experience, because you work with small nonprofits, is there a philosophy or an approach that you have specifically as it relates to relationship building for those who are, one, small shops, and then two, who are really focused on their immediate needs right now versus the long-term relationship building needs?
Yeah, I definitely think there can be quick wins in philanthropy, right? You have sometimes those grants that just, you just applied in the dark, you had no relationship and they come through. Or even you host an event that was, very cheap, to put on, but everyone comes out. You just, you have some great marketing. It just caught fire. Um, and I want to say, for me, philanthropy is so relational. And so even with those quick wins, I think to depend on those time and time again would be a mistake for small nonprofits. And so what I really tell them to do is like, where in your diversified revenue, where can you depend on a sustainable, financial, not philanthropic, but financial model? So there's a small theater nonprofit I work with, and they have a summer intensive. Every summer, you can depend on, your summer intensive participants yielding this much from the cost. It's still a very inexpensive summer intensive, and they give lots of scholarships, but you can depend on getting this much from participation from that intensive. So factor that in. That's your revenue builder. Same with Atlanta Ballet, and that's where some arts organizations have a luxury ticket prices. That's built into their revenue model. And so I really think it's thinking less about philanthropy and thinking about revenue holistically. What is your revenue model? And philanthropy is that's going to be the one that sustains you long term. So I would hesitate, and I do say this to small nonprofits. I was just talking to one that's a nonprofit that does murals. I would definitely stray away from philanthropy being your grants or even being your right now or even events like right now I'm going to make this much. I That's your sustain. Those You build that event over time. You build those grant relationships with foundations over time. And even your monthly donors, you're adding to them. You're building a sustainer pool of donors. And so that can end up being part of your revenue model. But as a new young nonprofit or even as a nonprofit that, gives a lot, to see philanthropy as your end all be all would be a mistake, I think. Unless you have angel donors that helped fund you to get from the start, that's different. It's very circumstantial. There are nonprofits who had founders who, hey, we're starting you off with this many gifts right away, but you do need a diverse revenue model in order to sustain. And so, yeah, thinking broadly about what are your offerings to the community and what are, I had someone who worked in They did, at Covenant House, they did workshops around, trust building. So how can we, provide these workshops to free around trust for youth experiencing homelessness, and then put a cost on it to maybe our corporate entities and bring them on as clients. And that's now a sustained revenue model for us where we can bring corporate entities in to do trust exercises, relationship exercises so they can build internal trust while also providing that same service to youth experiencing homelessness so they can experience trust in their day-to-day lifestyles with their community, with their caregivers. So yeah, just thinking broadly about what are the things that your nonprofit offers and how can that also be a sustainable revenue in places where people could use that service that aren't that could pay for it.
So basically, there's no fundraising model that you can think of that's not relationship based, which
I,
is important.
yeah,
It has people.
yeah,
Yeah.
I genuinely think that, and I think that that's a trap that unfortunately small nonprofits fall into, where they think just applying to grants will save them. And that's not to say it won't save you for right now, but is it sustainable forever? And that's where larger nonprofits have, they've thought about that, right? That's why they've been there the however many years. Or their programming isn't just, drop in the bucket programming. It's cyclical. It's annual. It's ongoing. So yeah, that's the difference between scaling and growth and sustaining and those who are not able to. Yeah, it's relationships.
Frankie, why did you transition from the arts to human services?
It's actually very sad why I transitioned. I'm born and raised in Atlanta, and I was in New York, which is, a playground for the arts. No matter what aspect of the arts you're in, if you're marketing in the arts, if you're fundraising in the arts, program in the arts, you have your pick of the litter. I was able to work across the board. I ended my career in the arts in New York at a museum, the Paley Center for Media. And I moved down to Atlanta to also work in arts fundraising and the upward mobility, unfortunately, in Georgia for arts fundraisers, for arts in general. There's not much. And you hit a ceiling here, which is sad. There's just, not that they're to say that there aren't organizations here, they're just not as many. And so you can't grow as fast, you can't engage as much. And yeah, that it was sad to leave that world here.
What do you love about fundraising and what can't you stand about fundraising?
I think what I love about fundraising is there's so much. It's just it's there's so much to dive into. There you can constantly learn and grow and things are constantly changing as donors change, as the world changes. I'm so intrigued by why people start nonprofits, why people give generationally based on different communities. It feels like the information and is never ending. And I could think about fundraising forever. And I love that. I love that it never ends. Yeah. And what I don't like about it, I don't like that sometimes and when I say we, I mean anyone who comes into the space, it's easy to get stuck. It's easy to think that, oh, this is how you fundraise. And it's like there's tons of ways, there's so many ways to fundraise, or this is what works. It's like maybe it worked over there at this time, but maybe it doesn't work over here at this time. So this idea that there's one way to do something or that one way is better or the right way to, there's so many variables. And so it does the vacuum that we can sometimes get in as fundraisers, as nonprofits, because a lot of people have been doing it for a long time. This idea of tried and true, is very common in the fundraising space. But what I like about fundraising is that there's so many places you can actually experiment, and we haven't even like scratched the surface.
I came into fundraising in 2011 through planned giving, and then, all of my career has predominantly been in fundraising. And I have found that space, and I think I know I'm not alone in this, that to be a lonely space. I think oftentimes for whether you're a major gift officer like I was for an institution, or you're an ED for an institution, that a lot of your experience as a fundraiser can be solo. Maybe you're a one-person team. Maybe if you're really lucky, you're a two-person team. You've got to be really at one of the very large nonprofits to have like 5 or 6 or 7 other colleagues in that space, and so you can feel like you have the whole weight of the world on your shoulders, keeping this operating budget or this capital campaign alive. And so I wanted to ask you if you found community in fundraising, whether that was in the nonprofit that you're working or either through membership groups, and if that was similar to the communities that you found through communal performance.
Yeah, dance was different. The arts is different. The arts and dance at, in my younger age, I would, I'm not part of that community anymore. So I wonder at the age I am now, if I were still dancing, if I were still performing, and I would ask some of my friends who are still in that space, how they feel. But at the younger age, when I was entering it, there was such a competitive aspect to it. And I think that's what drew me away from it too. I wasn't willing to compete. It was never a see. I never wanted to be like a see me. And a lot of dance is that, there's even in a ballet class, a teacher will tell you, if I'm not correcting you, that's a problem because I don't see you, right? And so this idea that you're constantly fighting to be seen, it was, it removes the feeling of the art form away from it. It removes the fun. It's, I'm constantly just wanting you to notice me. And to be perfect. And so I had to get out of that. And not to say that there wasn't community there in dance. There is. There's a beautiful community in dance, and I'm even a part of them in other ways. But I think at a younger age, you're fighting so hard to be part of a company, to be the soloist, to be in somebody's work, and I just wasn't willing to fight like that. I wasn't willing to audition like that. And what I found in philanthropy is that actually we have this gap. There are not enough fundraisers. There's not enough. And, I actually was talking to someone and they were saying, well, it's really hard to break into philanthropy. It's really hard to get a job. And, I, and, maybe that is true to break into it. You need like an internship, you need experience. But I have also found fundraisers will put another fundraiser on or another young person in the field on so quickly. That community is so strong and because they see the need constantly at these nonprofits. They see the need constantly in the community. And so I mean, I I think that there's such a gap in not in not in talent because I don't love that word, but in people coming into the philanthropic space. There's such a gap in, you know, um, that work wanting to be taken on because it is hard work. People do oftentimes feel uncomfortable asking for money. That you're seeing, that community gets built fast. And I mean, I've referred probably 3 people this week to jobs. you know, I'm like, hey, you should reach out to this person. Hey, you should do this person. So I think the community and philanthropy is in amongst fundraisers is we're constantly trying to uplift the world holistically. That's the job. It's mission work. So we're constantly trying to uplift the world holistically with mission work. So we're constantly trying to uplift each other, constantly trying to bring people in, constantly trying to put each other on. In a way, in dance, that wasn't the work, right? That it's not it. Not to say that it isn't mission work in dance, but it's just it's different work, and especially as a dancer, it's different work. But yeah, I felt so. I mean, some of the groups I've been a part of, um, F3, Fabulous Female Fundraisers, which I told you about. AFP has been a great resource for me. My local AFP chapter, Young Nonprofit Professional Network, has been a great resource for me. And then you can even get, so specific. If we're talking about, you know, networks just for organizations who work in homelessness or food insecurity. Your local food bank puts on, networking things. I remember when I was working at Clark Atlanta University, and we would do an AUC meetup where we would just hop around to each other's different cafeterias on Fried Chicken Wednesday and Morehouse, Spelman, and Clark Atlanta, and we would just, connect. just share. And sometimes we would talk shop, and sometimes we would just talk. And so, I think part of it is like building community and seeking community yourself. Where you see a gap, fill it. Um, and where you see an opportunity to be a part of something, ask. um, I think a lot of the community building is also being a self-starter in the space, which I know can also be hard. But yeah, AADO, African American Development Officers, I mean, there's actually been so many spaces that I have felt lucky to be a part of, and I felt lucky to introduce others to. Yeah.
Part of the reason why we do Black Philanthropy, our stories, is to honor our enslaved ancestors. That I think is so amazing that many of us could have come to come to this country via the bottom of a boat. That's how our ancestors came here, and now people are in the process of, like you, fundraising or and others funding projects around the country, which to me is so awesome, and I'm so proud of the people that we come from. So I wanted to offer that question to you: is there anyone or any community that you honor or think about as you've entered into this space of philanthropy, as a person of color, as a Black female in this space, that's particularly relevant for the work that you do as a fundraiser?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, I'm born and raised in Atlanta, and so is my mother. And my grandfather's from Georgia, and my great grandmother's from Georgia. My grandfather grew up on a sharecropping farm, so did my great grandmother. And my grandfather actually has the oldest Black barbershop in Atlanta. And when I think about, you know, and one of the reasons why Atlanta is so special to me is because it's a city where you have seen Black people thrive for so long. We've seen Black people thrive in Atlanta for so long, and my family's included in that legacy. And it's important for me to continue to see Black people, not just in Atlanta, but throughout the United States, thrive. And I honor my grandparents, my grandfather, my grandmother at every turn. And when one of the reasons working at Clark Atlanta was so special, my grandfather's barbershop is in the AUC area in a historic part of Atlanta. And when he passed away, we put a mural on the side of his barbershop. So his barbershop is still there, and there's a mural of him on the side of his barbershop. And every day as I drove into work, I would get to say good morning to him. And I felt so moved by his community work. He was such a pillar, and barbershops and places of gathering for Black people, like hair salons, barbershops, churches. My family also is part of a historic church here in Atlanta, Wheat Street Baptist Church. I, they're just colleges, universities like Clark Atlanta. They're just so important to our community and the fabric of our community. And to be interwoven into them and to be part of them and to tell their stories is so important to me. And so I honor my grandfather. When I think about Black philanthropy and the legacy of Black philanthropy, um, any moment I can get.
What's your grandfather's name, Frankie?
Willie
George.
George Axam.
Oh, good, good. That sounds very Black. Sounds like a Black man to me.
Yes,
Awesome. A Black barber in
a
particular.
Black barber.
Awesome.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Frankie, so something that you've talked about with previous guests who are also fundraisers is this desire for those who are fundraisers currently to leave the profession. Because it's painful. It could be a painful place. It could be a challenging place. Stephen Wallace and I, was the first Black fundraiser, first Black professional that I ever met in my career from 2011 to 2019. I met him while I was working for nonprofits. I met Stephen in 2014. And so for me, I hadn't known any Black professionals in philanthropy at all, fundraisers. And then I met Stephen Wallace, who of course is a master fundraiser. But part of what he talks about as he's someone who's in recruiting is the trend that he's seeing, not just with Black professionals in fundraising, but BIPOC in general, that there is a challenge to want to be here. And so the question that I had for you is I wanted to see, number one, are you seeing or experiencing a similar trend of people wanting to exit the profession? And then if you have any insight into what some of those challenges are that are Black and BIPOC fundraisers are wanting to leave the profession.
Yeah, it's so interesting because I've talked to a lot of young fundraisers, and I and I've talked to my colleagues as well, and I do think there's this feeling of feeling drained. I also think there's this feeling of you oftentimes feel stagnant. You're seeing your white colleagues, your white female colleagues, your white male colleagues move up, move higher, get jobs faster, move around easier, and you're find yourself stuck. And yes, there are plenty of Black professionals in our field who have moved up and gone very far, but we're not seeing it at the same rate. And depending on your climate, your environment, and who's surrounding yourself, it can feel like that's all you're seeing. It's just like that you're at a standstill and they're, leading. They're the thought leaders in the space, and you're a worker bee, right? And that can drain you. I've even seen it from my side, being now a service provider in nonprofit, where I'm looking around me in the tech space, and there is very little Black tech and philanthropy. I think like me and my husband are one of like maybe there's like two or three other Black tech led tech companies in philanthropy, like specific to philanthropy. And that in itself is draining, right? You're like, "Ugh, I don't want to be here, I don't want to do this, and even, in the donor space, depending on the space you're in, you're talking to a lot of white donors. And so you're like, "Ugh, I, you get tired, you get bogged down, you start to emotionally drain. So I am seeing people want to leave or go to more, consultant based work, or choose their be more thoughtful. Maybe it's not leave, but be more thoughtful with their work and the spaces they're in. I mean, I'm also seeing young fundraisers of color coming into the space, and it's hard, right? A lot of them, I feel like they're really focused on the grassroots elements of fundraising, and that is important. I was talking to a young fundraiser the other day, and we were talking about this idea of, you know, showing impact will get you dollars. And I'm like, as a fundraiser, I'm like, no, getting dollars will help us give impact. It's the other way around. We need the dollars to do impact. But I think a lot of younger fundraisers of color, especially as we saw, the unrest with George Floyd, as we were in the pandemic, as we saw, as we had these reckonings and awakenings, they're like, forget the donors, like let's make impact now. Let's community build, let's grassroots. And yes, I'm all about that, but that is a really hard model to replicate in a traditional fundraising nonprofit, right? That's a really hard model to that's a really hard model to replicate in an economic downturn. Dollars do fuel impact. And that's not to say you can't get impact without them, but the idea that you could completely remove the donor in like traditional fundraising aspects, I don't see that happening. And I think that's really hard for young fundraisers to battle with because they are so community driven, they are so grassroots. And I think that this idea of this exchange of funds and how you go about it, and the donor centric model, or even aspects of the donor centric model, is real. And again, that's not to say that community centric fundraising, because I'm a huge proponent of that. That's not to say that their way doesn't work, but I do think that you do have to have both. And I think that's where young fundraisers start to leave, is when they're like, I'm not going to fundraise like that. And so, yeah, it's hard work, and at times it can feel like it's not genuine work. And I think that also is what feels draining, depending on who you're talking to, how you're fundraising, who you're fundraising alongside. The work can feel surface. It's hard to sometimes remember the mission. It's hard to sometimes remember the bigger picture. It can feel like you're so far away from the goal.
And for so many donors, you often hear donors saying, you're my third, my fourth, my fifth. fundraisers that I've talked to. So why should I even invest in this relationship with the institution through you? We're not going to be here for another 6 months anyway. Um, and so they often say in sales, the difference between a contact and a contract is relationships, right? That you need relationships. Ultimately, people do business with people. And in the same way, fundraisers do business with donors, donors do business with fundraisers. But at that same time, there's got to be trust there, trust on both person's side that the other person's going to be there, um, that wants to be there. And I think the challenge, of course, then with fundraising is that it is a profession that people are thinking about. To your point, is do I have upward mobility here? If I don't, then is this the right place for me? Because I also have family to support. So there's this a complex dynamics of this exchange of funds in service of the young person's vision of impact, and all of our vision for impact, that impacts the longevity of how long people want to be here. And so to your point, it makes a lot of sense that younger folks who are like, we just got in the streets and we just marched and we did things without the funding, but that wasn't sustainable because you didn't have the funding, right? You can't do this work for free. EDs can't work for free. Nonprofits can't work for free. And so, but to your point at the beginning is that you've got to have a business model beyond just having a donor base, because those donors, particularly if you have one or two, like many nonprofits have, maybe a federal donor that's then removed all their funding. It's like, well, now they're in a real bind because they only had one donor or two donors. So,
It's like that old saying, like, don't put all your eggs in one basket. Like,
right.
that's not a good business model in a general business or a nonprofit. Yeah.
Ricky, can you help our listeners who might find it surprising that you might say that Black fundraisers, when they are fundraising predominantly from white donors, why the fundraisers might find that to be draining? What is the source of that drain?
Yeah, I often find that it depends on the organization. But I can say that oftentimes as a person of color, it can be draining to constantly educate. Whether that's you're educating on a certain population, a certain underserved population, a certain political climate, a certain space you're in, even regionally, to have to constantly educate on who you are or the community you're serving is can be draining. And it it's the money, the funds, sometimes can feel it's hard to gauge where the feeling of why they want to give, where that's coming from. And that can also be draining. Are these guilt dollars? Are these, what is your thought around me, the people that I'm serving? It's it's complicated. It's a complicated feeling. And there have been plenty of moments where, and this doesn't just happen in the Black community and with, non-Black donors, but this can happen also in the queer community, where you're working at queer organizations and you're raising money from non-queer folk who don't get it, and to educate and then also have to then petition for them to support can be draining.
It reminds me when I first got my first major giving position, and it was a six-figure job, but I had just been making $60,000 the year before, so to jump from 60,000 to 125 in a couple of months was a big deal for me. But I remember that I was moving from New York with no car, to Los Angeles to take on this job with a car, and I remember, the car that I chose to buy was like a Mercedes, which that was not the greatest car for me to
It's a choice.
buy.
It's a choice.
It wasn't a good use of
Yeah.
funds. It was, Mercedes, I am a proponent, but my finances were not, even though, I had that six-figure who knew that when you have a six-figure job that most of it goes to taxes, when you're single and have no dependents, and so all that to say, it wasn't a great financial decision, but the pressure that I felt to get that car because I thought, well, I'm a Black fundraiser going in a predominantly white space.
Yeah.
talking to predominantly white men, the expectation that I had to look a part,
Yeah.
that I didn't want them to see me with I didn't want them to already make some assumptions
Mhm.
based on my race, based on my gender, at least my car, despite that I went to Harvard or whatever other degrees that
Right.
I might, bring into that room to sort of justify that I was worthy of one's interaction. That the car was ultimately the thing that's like, well, they at least have to see that I can afford a nice car. I think, again, one could argue that was self-imposed, that was projected. Nobody asked me to buy that car, but I can say that the internal pressure was real, and I think that is oftentimes what I think. I don't know any fundraisers, regardless of race, who are not tired, who are not, going to another gala, who are not going to another dinner, who are not going to some house. Basically, the things that fundraisers do to get these dollars on behalf of institutions is significant, regardless of race, regardless of gender. In addition, I think those fundraisers who do identify as Black, the racial difference, often the gender difference, if you are a Black female who's fundraising, um, that can differ with the people that you are soliciting funds from, it can be exhausting for all those reasons, internalized or not. So thank you for that clarification, because I thought it was important, particularly in 2025, where this conversation about, does race even matter anymore? Does gender even matter anymore? Do these differences matter? For many of us, they do. They always have, and they're not going to change depending on who has the mic. Tell us a little bit about Grantyd. What in all of this? One, how did you transition from, you've gone from being a dancer to then going into fundraising in the art space, then transitioning into human services? How does that then lead you into, and your husband into, Grantyd?
It We fell into it, and I was actually fundraising at Clark Atlanta at the time, but I'm always a part of equity work, specifically local arts equity work. So I was grant writing on the side for a small Black theater nonprofit here in Atlanta. And my husband saw me writing a grant. He had just gone through the Google layoff, so he was looking for projects to fill his time, not necessarily not for money, but just he was living off vibes at the time, and he was I was lucky he was able to do that. And He saw me writing a grant, and he found the process to be awful, and so he created me a product and process that auto populated grants with my nonprofit's information in the grant application, and we were able to patent that process. And from there, we have a provisional patent on it. And from there we were actually started, it's really we thought, the idea behind it is that it's for small teams who don't have enough manpower to write grants. It helps you write grants faster. But in doing that, we actually saw that the biggest problem was not the grant writing and the time. It was that these small nonprofits actually oftentimes don't have an understanding of philanthropy at all. And that's not because of anything on their part. It's simply because that there is privilege in being part of the philanthropic space and acknowledging that privilege and even having access to that information, access to who are the family foundations in your state, in your city. Have you ever been in the room with them? Access to the information that 90% of funders are invite only. Access to the information of how corporate funding is even broken down and how you get corporate dollars. They aren't in those rooms. These are small, nonprofits who are really grassroots, food banks, after school programs being run out of, someone's home or small business because they saw a need in their community. Someone who does run a food pantry. Someone who has a clinic where they go around and do free mammograms, for women in their community. And so, yeah, just, realizing that their skill set and their information understanding wasn't rooted in philanthropy. So then we created a dashboard where we leverage IRS data to show the funding landscape, specifically from the foundation point of view. And yes, there are tools that do that, but the difference is they market to nonprofits and to fundraisers. And so, what does it look like to bring in nonprofits that are not in the fundraiser space, what does it look like to market to grassroots-led organizations, community building organizations? And what does it look like to display information to them in a way where they don't have to know everything already? They don't have to search. They can just engage. And so really helping small nonprofits visualize the data that's out there and really gain access and insight into the fundraising landscape based on their sector, their city, their state, their size, based on the nonprofits around them. So really, we're in the equity space, visualizing data for small grassroots nonprofits.
So what does that look like, Frankie? What's the difference between a service provider who is marketing towards a fundraiser, or to a nonprofit that is already like a well-oiled machine versus someone who is operating a nonprofit out of their house? What is the gap there in knowledge that
Yeah.
you're fulfilling?
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the biggest gaps is language, right? Or even knowing what to search for or how to search. So, a small nonprofit will already have an idea of the foundations and funders, or not a small, a well-established nonprofit who has a fundraising team will already have an idea of the foundations and fundraisers in their space and what they give to, who they give to. And maybe they're just looking for a few, they want to do a deeper dive into those people, or, you know, they're trying to find a few other resources, but they have a base of donors versus a grassroots nonprofit. They don't know how funding in their state is broken down. They don't know that these foundations even exist. They don't even know them by name. So creating a dashboard solution that is user friendly for people who don't have an idea of the landscape and also provides a view to them of the landscape. I think that's a big thing. People do not even know what the landscape looks like, how much arts funding is given in the state of Georgia versus the state of Mississippi versus New York. That's really good insight. So you can have an understand, it's one thing to be like, oh, there are people are there are dollars out there. You just have to apply. How many dollars? That would be good to know. Who's given the dollars? That would also be good to know. Who else have they given those dollars to? Am I like those other organizations? Am I completely different? So you're not just shooting in the dark. And so larger nonprofits kind of already have an understanding of the landscape, and the tools that are out there for them, they're not landscape tools. They're tools to help them do deeper research into things they already know. And so, what does it look like to provide for small grassroots nonprofits an understanding of the landscape and then also the ability to now research after you get to know your landscape? So that's really where our discovery tool is, that equity builder, that window into a world that you do need to know to sustain.
Is it subscription based?
It's a subscription-based dashboard. So you go to grantyd.com, granted with a Y, and you log into the dashboard. And immediately when you log in, you can see the philanthropic landscape based on all the family foundations. And we leverage that data from IRS 990 data. All funders have to be in the IRS database. And we pull that information together and we give you a visual view of what philanthropy looks like. And you can get really granular down, like I said, to your city, or you can look very broadly. You could look at the entire human services sector throughout the United States and the funders that give and how human services is broken up. Or you can look at human services and specifically look at just housing in your city. So yeah, it's really that bird's eye view all the way down to that small view, and it's a dashboard to make it data is best taken in when you can visually see it. We're not all data analysts. Most of us aren't.
Mhm.
And so taking
Mhm.
that data and making it palatable so people can actually use it to glean better insights.
Let's say I use you Granted, I become a subscriber and I find a grant that's a possible maybe through a family foundation. Th Can I use Granted to apply for it, or do I have to do it on my own?
Yeah, so this is a research tool, and like I said, most grants are 90% of funders don't have open apply applications, and we show that in Granted, like who's open apply, who is not. And even still, they change their patterns on when they open applications. So we really use it as a research tool for you to get to know that funder, and then to take next steps to start to engage. That engagement could look like seeing all their past giving and who they've given to, and maybe they've given to a nonprofit in your community that you're already in relationship with. So reaching out to that nonprofit and being like, hey, I see that you were funded by this organization. Would love a warm intro. Or if you're inviting them to an event, would love to come. Another example is seeing a foundation and following them on LinkedIn. You can, on our site, you can actually follow their point of contact on LinkedIn should they have one or their board. But following them on LinkedIn, there was a foundation here in Atlanta that changed executive directors. And, you know, following that foundation, seeing, oh my gosh, they have a new executive director, following her on LinkedIn, seeing that she's actually speaking at an event, at a local event, at a venue here in Atlanta, and the tickets were $30, right? So, like, doing that relationship building, as many community builders and people who have small nonprofits are already doing naturally in their work, they're just not doing it in philanthropy. So, the first step is to get to know who these people are. And then the next step, start to build based on the information you have about them.
If you had been funded by a foundation, it never would have occurred to me to reach out to you and say, "Could I get a warm intro?" Only because I would think that fundraisers want to keep their donors really
Mm,
close to chest. That's been my experience,
yeah.
and that continues to be the case. So I wonder, in your experience as a fundraiser, did you find that asking nonprofits or fundraisers for warm intros actually worked for you?
Yeah, I would say it's worked immensely. And I think that that is and there are some nonprofits who might say, oh, I'm not, I don't feel comfortable doing that. I think the difference is specifically in the foundation space, foundations, their jobs are to give. That's literally the work, that's what the team they hire, and sometimes they just have their families that are running it, but a lot of them do have executive directors. The job is to be philanthropic, the job is to give. And so, this I think that that donor information aspect, it makes more sense when it's an individual donor, but the job for foundations is to engage with their community, to give to their community, whether that's a sector or a city, a state, a county. And so if a small nonprofit isn't interested or another nonprofit isn't interested in providing that information, try a different nonprofit, or find other ways to get engaged or give in or get in. If they have an email, send them, a letter, send them an email. Um, but I have found specifically getting in the foundation space and engaging with foundation executive directors, people are usually very open about giving up that information because it is already public data that this is a foundation giving to this space. We were able to leverage all that data through the IRS. And so it's really important in that space. I feel like for fundraisers also to shift their mindset, an individual donor for sure makes sense. But in the foundation space, that is community space. They're there to, I was talking to actually someone recently about Billy Aaron, who is Hank Aaron's was Hank Aaron's wife and a philanthropist herself. She worked for UNCF, and her and Hank Aaron had a family foundation, Chasing Dreams Foundation, and they give to college students and they give to a lot of HBCUs. And I was talking to a friend, and I was talking about Billy and how she was a donor, and they were like, "Oh well, Billy's our donor," and I was like, "Well, actually, Chasing the Dream." That foundation gives to all the HBCUs, you know, and so this idea that a donor or even specifically in the foundation space is yours. I would definitely want to abandon that notion and push back against how even move people moving in that way because it is all about community building and you don't know when you will need a contact from that other nonprofit, not necessarily just for a donor but for anything. I mean, I've used my relationships for so many reasons outside of just a philanthropic one. So yeah, I definitely and if they say don't reach out, that again, like I said, you try someone else or try other ways in. But that is a good starting place to be in community with the other people that you're in, that are doing the similar work as you, or that those foundations are in community with.
In Grantyd, how is Grantyd identifying who the contact is for the
The
foundation?
foundations have to identify those. Yeah, and so, the IRS, the 990 data is pretty formatted. They do have to give certain information, and so everything that they are required to surface, we surface, and we update it as the IRS updates it. So it's updated monthly. So yeah.
Does Grantyd help fill out the application, or is it just providing?
Yeah, so that's our other
Okay.
tool. So we have our secondary tool that my husband initially built for me that helps you fill out grants. We use screen reader technology to extract the grant questions from the application. That's the same technology that people who are visually impaired use to read a screen. So it extracts the questions into our platform where you can write the grant yourself or use AI to read your grounding documents. So if you do choose to use the AI function, you do have to have documents to refer to fill out the grant for you, and then it auto populates it back to the application using our web extension.
What other services does Grantyd provide, Frankie?
So we're really rooted in data, and we think that data, like I said, with our discovery tool, is really the insight into how nonprofits can move forward. And so we do we provide data services. So we do projects that that kind of span the space, but some could include data cleanup. A lot of nonprofits struggle with their data cleanup. Others can include data visualization. So let's say you have your CRM and all this data, but we can visualize all that data for you in a dashboard where you can see how your individual giving actually performs year over year through a bar chart. You can see how what your major gift portfolio looks like in a pie chart. And so you can take all that data in your CRM and you can visualize it, whether that's for yourself or your board. It can be automatically updated, it can be static. We can do data visualization down to small projects. So if you want to see year over year how your gala is performing or how your individual, annual campaign is performing at the holidays, and really being able to show you where you can grow, and also where maybe you need to grow that you didn't see yet, where there's some gaps. So visualizing data, I feel like nonprofits never have the time to do that. But that visualization piece is really what makes you change your patterns of behavior. Just seeing a number, it's like, oh, I received this much in individual giving this year versus last year. Oh, we're this much off. But really seeing how different that is in a percentage in a pie chart can make you be like, okay, but we can uptick here or we can move this here. So that visualization piece. We also do survey design. Oftentimes people don't know the right questions to ask in a survey, or they just send it out in an email, or they send it to the wrong people. So how does survey design play, and even the way you conduct the survey design, play into having data that's actually tangible, that's helpful? Because oftentimes we do surveys and it's like, okay, but we only got 10% of people and they all are the same type of person. Is that survey helpful? And did we design it correctly to get, the right data and the right info? So really playing in the data space for small nonprofits and mid-sized nonprofits who don't have the time, the tools. My husband came from an analyst background, and I remember he was like, "Oh, asked me about, my analyst when I was working at Covenant House, Georgia." And I was like, "I'm the analyst." And he was like, "You definitely are not." And we saw that there was a gap, at these larger organizations. They have analysts in every aspect of their work in sales, and that's what helps them move the needle in sales. Analysts are a crucial part of the work, and that is something that we're missing in the nonprofit space. So, how can data be a source for good for us to move the needle forward? And tech being a source for good, we use tech tools obviously to get these data dashboards to piece them together, and really providing nonprofits with that work.
And for all the EDs out there who are like, that sounds so awesome, Frankie. And then do we have it in our budget? Can you say a little bit more about what sort of budget commitment your services for Grantyd cost?
Yeah, so for our proposals tool, which is the auto population tool that I talked about, that helps you apply for grants faster, that's $20 a month. The tier using AI. For our discovery tool that helps you find funders in your area or in your sector throughout the United States, that's $40 a month. We have discounts for annual pricing. And then for our services solutions our bespoke solutions where we do data dashboards and data integrity and data cleaning projects. Those really are conversations about what the workload is, what your data looks like. So, but we are rooted in equity again. So we're coming at every project with the understanding that your budget is different, your needs are different. What is the ask? And so we start that always with a conversation.
Frankie, when did you and your husband launch Grantyd?
Yeah, so we launched Grantyd about a year ago, but we, as far as like doing the work, but we fully launched our first product May of 2025, and we have been growing ever since. And our discovery platform is our newest one. We launched that about a month ago, and we are actually working on already some data projects with currently two healthcare providers in the nonprofit space. One in breast cancer, and one is a healthcare foundation. And yeah, we're so that's happening as well ongoingly.
One thing that I love to ask our guests relates to this question of hope. And it mostly is relevant because right now, the more conversations that I have each day, I think the more less hope I'm finding people have, whether it's in philanthropy or the nonprofit space, in the political space. But you got a beautiful smile, you've got a beautiful spirit. You were made to be a fundraiser, and made to do this work to help other fundraisers in this space. And so I wondered for you right now that we are in the third quarter of the year 2025, do you have hope these days? And if you do have hope, where is your hope coming from?
I do have hope. I do. But I am someone who, I always have hope in every setting. And I think that hope is coming from, you know, Grantyd has provided me the opportunity to talk to so many nonprofits doing so much work. And, I get why people consult. Because I think when you are able to see the bigger picture, again, like I said, those small corners of the universe. Someone who created a small nonprofit in their town that was hit by a hurricane. Um, Someone who, puts up a micro library outside of schools, outside of, these small little bursts of excitement and energy and hope in these different communities that gives me hope. Humanity is so much more than headlines or so much more than one person. Um, Humanity is so much more than the person we think has the stage and the mic. It's it's all these other little people doing the work, sometimes silently, sometimes in a big way, sometimes with a spotlight, sometimes without, and they give me hope. Yeah, people give me hope.
Another place to draw some hope from is that you are empowering these institutions, right? These small grassroots communities, because I think for many of us as fundraisers, I think every fundraiser knows that the difference between being able to have impact or not is funding oftentimes, and being able to fund one's operating budget or fund that program. And the challenge, of course, is then the knowledge of how to get that money and how to have that relationship. And so part of what you do, Frankie, and part of what your husband does as well, is it sounds very much like you create some sense of empowerment and self determination by arming people with information. Right now, whether people utilize that information or not is really up to them. But ultimately, you don't have to have a small grassroots institution that is operating a micro library, out of their home, out of their driveway, that then is unable to figure out where there might be funding for someone who cares about libraries, who cares about knowledge, who cares about community. So, I thank you, and I thank Dwight as well. I think we all are grateful to you to be able to provide what can feel like esoteric knowledge, as you
Mhm.
said, privileged knowledge, and to democratizing it in many ways by making it more accessible.
Yeah, knowledge is
And
everything.
everyone's got an idea on their small business idea or their big business idea, but not everyone has the courage to be able to execute it. And so, can you talk a little bit about what it was like for you and your husband to not just have an idea on, hey, I see that this grant application is taking a really long time. Let me help you out. How did that then transition into, let's formalize this and turn it into our own company?
I think the thing with philanthropy and tech is that there is not much. And so we saw an opportunity. And we specifically saw a population, which is the smaller grassroots nonprofits, being not only underserved and under resourced, but completely overlooked by tech in the philanthropic space. And I'm really, and even it's not even in the philanthropic space, just in the room, they're not at the same conferences. They're not at, the fundraising conferences. If they're at conferences at all, they're not in the same conversations. And so And even as people talk about small nonprofits, it's grassroots led. It's very much like, oh well, they don't have, their budgets aren't clean, or oh well, their model is splotchy, or it's this idea that they're not enough, and again, really pushing back against that. So we saw this opportunity to, like you said, arm them with information, arm them with as much as possible. And you know, I I couldn't, in any setting, you can't help but notice the inequities. And what are the actual things that you can put in place to combat inequity? And so that's really what, why we did this. And so I felt really strong coming into it. Now, how I felt as I was going through the startup phase, that has gone up and down. The emotions of having a startup and a startup with your husband are plenty. But the feeling of taking the leap was strong. I felt very strong. I felt very solid in that. And I still feel solid in the overall vision. There are way more grassroots nonprofits than there are big, shiny, federated ones at the top. Not that they don't deserve funding too, but the idea that small nonprofits that are scrappier, less polished, don't deserve information, don't deserve funding. Yeah, that's the mission. That's the work. Yeah. Because when you try to leave them behind, you're leaving all the people they serve behind.
Frankie, how do people stay in contact with you?
Yeah, so you can find me on LinkedIn at Francesca Axam Frederick. You can also come to Grantyd.com. That's Grantyd, GRANTYD.com. And check us out. And yeah, I look forward to engaging with you all soon.
Frankie, we're so grateful for you. Thank you for taking the time to be on Black Philanthropy, Our Stories. Of course, our goal is to celebrate leaders like you, like Dwight, who are doing awesome things in philanthropy. Thank you for trusting us with helping to tell your story. Thank you to our listeners for trusting Frankie and I with your time today. We never take that for granted. And please seek out Frankie and Dwight's Grantyd.